Welcome back to Passionate World Talk Radio. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. Our motto is educate, enlighten, entertain. And today on Lest with a T, we forget with hosts Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurzel, and Lillian Cauldwell. And our first topic is the Indians and the U.S. And Miss Skinner will begin.
Hi, everybody. So what I'm going to start off with is a summary overview of what led up to the actual genocide of our Native American Indians throughout history. And so I'm going to give the kind of what led up to all of it happening, and then Lillian's going to follow me with the information that she learned. And then we'll hear from wonderful Betsy with what she also wants to share with everybody. So before the arrival of white settlers way back in 1492, there were living in the USA 5 million Indians. Yet by 1800, the number plummeted to 600,000 from 5 million. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the number of Native Americans in 1900, this is really devastating, was only 237,000, the lowest in history. Among them, more than a dozen tribes, such as the Pequot, Mohegan, and Massachusetts, were completely extinct. That was by 1900. Between 1800 and 1900, the American Indians lost more than half of their population, and their proportion in the U.S. total population dropped from 10.15% to 0.31%. Throughout the 19th century, while the U.S. population grew by 20 to 30% every 10 years, the Indian population experienced a precipitous decline. Now, currently, the Indian and Alaska Native population accounts for only 1.3% of the total U.S. population. Indians were pushed from the east to the barren west, and most of the Indian reservations were located in remote areas unfit for agriculture, much less for investment in industrial development. Most of the tribes with scattered reservations of varying sizes were unable to obtain adequate land for development and were therefore subject to severe development restraints. There are currently about 310 Native American reservations in the United States today, accounting for about 2.3% of the U.S. territory, and not all federally recognized tribes have their own reservations. At the beginning of the 1800s, at the beginning of the 1830s, nearly 125,000 Native Americans lived on millions of acres of land in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida, land that their ancestors had occupied and cultivated for generations. But by the end of the decade, very few natives remained anywhere in the southeastern United States. Working on behalf of white settlers who wanted to grow cotton on the Indians' land, the federal government forced them to leave their homelands and walk hundreds of miles to a specially designated Indian territory across the Mississippi River. This difficult and oftentimes deadly journey is what we all know of as the Trail of Tears. And I think, Lillian, you're going to go into a little bit more detail about that. Now, this is kind of how it all started. White Americans, particularly those who lived on the Western frontier, often feared and resented the Native Americans they encountered. Is this sounding a little bit familiar to the other series that we've presented to you? The Holocaust, etc. Okay. To them, American Indians seemed to be an unfamiliar, alien people who occupied land that white settlers wanted and believed they deserved. Some officials in the early years of the American Republic, such as President George Washington, believed that the best way to solve this Indian problem was to simply civilize the Native Americans. The goal of this civilization campaign was to make Native Americans as much like white Americans as possible by encouraging them to convert to Christianity, learn to speak and read English, and adopt European-style economic practices such as the individual ownership of land and other property, including, in some instances in the South, enslaved persons. One of the things that I read that they just really made a decision about early on is they didn't like the looks of the Native American people. They were too different from them. Their customs were too different. Their cultures were too different. And their skin was too dark. And they made the decision early on, when they came and immigrated to the United States from the European countries, that they didn't belong here and they were going to do something about it. So with that said, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Lillian, and she's going to pick up now where I've left off, giving you this kind of summary of what led up to the decision to eradicate Native Americans from the United States.
Now, when the presidents were first put into office, they were voted by the majority of the people. And the people put these gentlemen into office over them to dictate to the rest of the country, with Congress and the Senate helping them, the rules that they believe and the laws that they justify, that everybody obeyed. So the presidents of our country dictated the policies for the American Indians. And as stated by Lisa Skinner, George Washington, who was voted to become the first president of the United States, really did not have much admiration for the Native American Indians. In fact, like the British, he would use them if he needed them, but most of the time he really had no use for them. And he believed that they really had no right to the land upon which they and their ancestors have lived for so long. His belief was the white man had the right to take this land because it was their land. It was land seized by them originally by the British colonists. And as they stayed on the land and lived there and had their kids, each generation brought down the notion that Indians did not belong here. They should go somewhere else because they were not true Americans. In fact, Washington really did not distinguish them between the Black man who he enslaved, and he believed that the American Indian also wasn't capable of thought, of acting in human-like behavior. And so he felt that they should be enslaved as well as the Black man because they were of less intellect than the white person. However, By the time you got to John's son, John Quincy Adams, he had a different take on what he believed about the American Indian. He believed that they did have a soul. He also thought they should be treated better because he wasn't convinced that divine providence had stated that they should be enslaved or taken in and re-educated. So he tried to give them some dignity, tried to give the tribal councils more authority over their own people. But it wasn't until close to the late 19th century that you had other presidents who followed that lead. Abraham Lincoln, although he was against slavery, was not for Indians either. And apparently he allowed his generals to destroy and get rid of any Indian, man, woman, child. He made no distinction, and to wipe out entire villages because he had absolutely no use for them. And when he went into the White House, he really did not acknowledge them as living human beings who deserve to live on the same land as free men as the white people did. And I'm not saying he was a bad president. He wasn't, but for his time. And ladies and gentlemen, you have to understand, we cannot judge these people by 21st century standards because they all mostly came from Western Europe, and England, Ireland, and Scotland came in first. They were the original colonists, and these people believed that they had a right to extend their empire. And because of that right, if you remember your history correctly, where did that take them? That took them to Africa. It took them to India. It took them to South America. It took them to Australia, and it took them to Canada. While Australia wants to break it off with England, and Canada is the only country that's willing to remain under the colonial political gadget that Britain established during their colonization era. So please, when you look at what our presidents did, you have to excuse them because they were brought up on the notion that Theodore Roosevelt finally expressed, and nobody ever did. A good Indian is a dead Indian. Or to rephrase it, 9 out of 10 Indians are bad, and if you can exterminate all of them, it would be better. And that was pretty much the philosophy of the presidents from 1700 into the 1900s. Things began to change in the 20th and the 21st century, where some of the presidents recognized that they really needed to do something because despite all their efforts, the Indians didn't die. They didn't have any other place to go, unlike Abraham Lincoln theory of taking all the African Americans and sending them back to Africa. They did not have that type of plan. Our country really to where the Native American Indians could go back to. Siberia certainly was not an option by that time. Next time we get together, we will talk about the 20th and the 21st century presidents and how they reverse their policy. However, I will say this. Currently, the United States government is trying to figure out how to get the land back from the Indians, which have been on their reservations for the past 100 years, because minerals and other precious metals have been found on the reservation land, and the federal government believes that they should have the authority and the ability to go there and take it. And this is a big question mark. And I think you ought to think about how you would like it if you were living in your neighborhood and the US government discovered a vein of gold or silver or precious metal that you need to use for your cell phones or laptops, and whether you would like it if they came in and displaced you and your whole neighborhood to get at something that would tear up the environment. So when they were through, there was nothing to come back to. And I'll now turn it over to Betsy.
Hi, everyone. I really appreciate the research that Lillian and Lisa gave. Very informative. Thank you. I remember, because I grew up in the 60s, my dad watching the Westerns, and they gave Hollywood's image of the Native American. And what did you hear on the TV? Indian giver, which I think is pretty ironic that if someone took something back that they gave you, they called you an Indian giver when it was the white man who took away from the Native Americans. Was another phrase is a good engine is a dead engine, and that's what they called Indians. Very nasty, horrible depiction that Hollywood gave the Native Americans. And if you really want to see a great series, Centennial, I think it was James Michener. It was in the 70s. And actually, I watched it with Matt, and I had never watched it before. And you could see it's fictional, but this happened where the Europeans, they took over, they kept taking land away from the Indians, Native Americans, and how they were treated. And I remember one scene where the US soldiers were killing the Indians, and there was two children, and the one officer said, kill them, nits turn to lice. That's just horrible. We did a Holocaust here, didn't we? The US,
Oh,
the
yes.
Native Americans. And that is just mind-boggling to me. And the Native Americans were not treated with respect, even though they were heroes in World War II. I'm going to talk about Ira Hayes. Johnny Cash wrote a ballad of Ira Hayes. Ira Hayes was, I believe, from Arizona. He was a Pima Indian. He was at Iwo Jima. He was in that picture. Have you ever see the picture of them raising the flag on Mount, I think it's Suribachi? Terrible at pronouncing names. He was one of them that was there. He was a hero. How is he treated? Horrible. How was he treated when he came back home? Terrible. He died. He drowned 2 inches of water because he was drunk. They called it ballad, Drunken Ira Hayes. And then there's a lot of, I'm going to go way off here. There's a lot of health issues among the Native Americans, diabetes, alcohol. I always wanted to go to the Indian reservation myself, but I never did. I always felt bad for the Native Americans. They got the raw deal, people. Can you imagine, as Lillian was saying, living on your land, you farmed it, you took care of it, and then someone comes along and says you have to leave? This is what we did. The Trial of Tears, just heartbreaking. The massacre of Wounded Knee, horrible. And why? You know, you have to ask. This is what hatred does. This is what prejudice and hatred produces. It kills people. And that's what I have to say. It's really very, to me, very heartbreaking, because we're no better, in my eyes, than the Germans. You know, what happened in World War II to what we did to the Native Americans. We all bleed red blood, people. and we're more alike than we are different. I think it's time in this 2023, we need to get along. We need to put aside our differences and be human to each other. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
I think that's quite a lot. And I think that people have to understand that while everybody's excited about going to outer space, the moon, Mars, we need to clean up our act before we go out into outer space. Because if we bring our prejudice and our present behavior to a new planet, we'll just start the hatred and the prejudice and the killing all over again. It'll just be a different atmosphere in which we'll be in. In fact, there was an article that I read stating that without NASA's presence, the Russians and the Chinese will put a moon base up on the moon way before we ever get there, which is ironic since we took all the Nazi scientists from Hitler to help us get on the moon in the first place. We're still going to come in second place. And while you may laugh about it and think it's funny, it's not funny to the people who want to exploit the minerals on these new planets, especially the moon. I don't know how Lisa and Betsy feel, but it disgusts me that people with money, the celebrities, the smart speakers, the politicians, have already bought plots of land on the moon. Really? I think that their money would be better spent in trying to clean up planet Earth instead of buying themselves real estate on the moon or Mars, because isn't that the same philosophy that got us into trouble originally with the Native American Indians? Comments, lady?
I agree, Lillian. I think we should concentrate on Earth, cleaning up Earth, and taking care of what is down here before we go up to the moon. I personally don't desire to go to the moon. I'd rather stay here on Earth. But you're right. If there is life on those planets, it's going to start all over. We don't get our act together down on Earth.
Lisa?
I think that this is kind of history once again repeating itself. I mean, this is what our fourth series that we've done on Lest We Forget. And it's apparent that the circumstances and the behavior of people seem to be pretty consistent, only with different groups of people. I think that, to me, this is one of the most heartbreaking parts of history that ever occurred. But again, it's just another atrocity that has happened in our history. We've talked about the Jews. We've talked about Japanese internment camps. We've talked about women. Now we're talking about Native Americans. I don't think there's any question that history continues to repeat itself. I want to just share a couple other things that I uncovered. Statistics reveal that since its independence in 1776, the U.S. government has launched over 1,500 attacks on the Indian tribes, slaughtering the Indians, taking their lands, and committing countless crimes against them. Since the colonists set foot in North America, they have systematically and extensively hunted the American bison, which the Native Americans lived on and thrived on, cutting off the source of food and basic livelihood that they counted on to live, and consequently causing their death from starvation in large numbers. So not only did they enact these huge massacres throughout 2 centuries to exterminate the Native Americans, but then they also cut off their food supply, so the rest of them who survived starved to death. And I don't know, it's just, when I was reading all this material, my heart was literally breaking into a billion pieces, that we as a nation were responsible for this atrocity that happened in our history. And it shames me. It really does. I just think that this is one of the saddest things that has occurred in our history. And I didn't think I realized to the extent until I did the research just how poorly we treated this culture of human being.
And we're not getting too much better. I will remind people one thing that they ought to know. During the French and Indian War, the Native American Indians decided they would do better with the British and the French than with the Americans. So they enlisted with the French and the English. And the English had no way of knowing how many people were killed by the Indians. So the British showed the Indians how to scalp a person and bring them their hair as proof that they killed their their enemy. So please, people, the Indians did not learn how to scalp people until the British and the French, those nice white foreigners, showed them how to do it so they could count coups. Counting coups means how many of the enemy you slew. For the Indians, killing meant riding on horseback, riding up to the enemy and tapping them on the shoulder and then riding back. That was counting coups. They did not scalp until the white man taught them how to do it. So when you see the Westerns on TV, please remember that a white man taught the Native American population how to scalp. They did not do that before the Europeans came to this shore. And yes, I'm angry because everybody says that, and yet nobody understands the history behind it. And you really have to know what happened before you attack somebody and accuse them of something they were not responsible for. They would not get paid by the British until they produced a scalp. And let me tell you something, in the military, they have other ways of doing it, but it's the same things, folks. It hasn't changed. My call to action is this: go and learn your history, especially about the Native American Indians, because with the economic plus that their casinos are now bringing on, they now have the capacity to stand up to our government and demand what's rightfully theirs. And it's about time. Is it going to make things difficult for us? Hell yes. Is it going to make things even more difficult when our prestigious Congress and Senate realize that they're not going to take this crap anymore? Out of the words of Clint Eastwood, make my day. So be forewarned and be aware that it's now time for the Native American Indians, like the African Americans, to raise up and demand what they're due. All the promises we wrote into those treaties, half of them, 2/3 of them, were never delivered on. And now is their time. I want to thank everybody for attending to this afternoon show. And if you wish to talk to the individual hosts who participate in this podcast, Lisa Skinner, please provide your information.
Yeah, my email address is dementiawhisperer1 gmail.com. And I look forward to hearing your comments about the episode we just presented to you. And to quote from the movie Independence Day, the first thing that kind of just popped into my head, payback is a bitch.
Betsy?
Thanks for listening, everyone. That was interesting, Lillian. I didn't know that about the Europeans teaching the Native Americans about scalping. So thanks for that information.
I read that same thing myself, and they called the Native American savages.
Yeah. Well, the British are pretty nasty people. And so are the French, and so are the Americans. Don't get me started.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes, please comment, folks. Send your comments in. My email is Sloan, SLOAN, Betsy, BETSY 31 @gmail.com.
Lillian Cauldwell, the primary host of Lest We Forget, although I like to take third place, just letting you guys know. You can contact me at pwrnetwork@llc@gmail.com. Please text us, DM us, send us an email. Let us know whether you like where we're going with this program. Maybe you have some suggestions of other atrocities that we can talk about. I mean, there's just so many that we couldn't deal with all of them in 1 year anyway. If we really wanted it, this show would take us up to the rest of our lives. So maybe we're missing something that you really want to address this year and not wait until next year. We want to thank you all very much for joining us. You can hear this all over again at youtube.com/PWR Network LLC _PW Talk Radio, twitter.com/PWTR, facebook.com/Passionate World Radio, and https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. And yes, you can find us and at least 15 other directories from social media. So please don't be shy. Let us know how you feel about Lest You Forget. Thank you very much, and see us next Friday at 3 o'clock with another episode dealing with Native American Indians and the U.S.
Thanks for being here, everybody.